Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover some of history's most intriguing and mysterious events. Tonight, we are about to journey into the cold, remote wilderness of the Ural Mountains in the former Soviet Union. This is not just any story of exploration or adventure. It is one of unanswered questions, haunting details, and a mystery that continues to spark debate more than 60 years later. Our story begins in February 1959, when a group of 9 young hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out on an ambitious winter expedition. At the head of the team was Igor Dyatlov, a talented student and experienced outdoorsman whose name would later become forever tied to this tragic case. The group's goal was both challenging and honorable: to earn a higher certification in mountaineering by successfully completing a trek through some of the harshest and most unforgiving terrain of the Ural region. These hikers were not amateurs. Each member of the team had been carefully selected for their skill, determination, and endurance. They were men and women in their early 20s, full of energy, dreams, and a sense of adventure that drove them to test their limits against nature's most demanding conditions. For them, the icy wilderness was not something to fear, but rather a proving ground, a chance to demonstrate their strength, resilience, and unity as a team. The group prepared meticulously before setting off. They studied maps, gathered equipment, and organized supplies with precision. Everything was designed to ensure their survival in the brutal cold of a Russian winter. Yet even with their knowledge and preparation, the Ural Mountains remained an unpredictable adversary. Strong winds, blizzards, and extreme temperatures were constant threats that could turn even the most experienced expedition into a struggle for survival. On January 23, 1959, the hikers departed by train, filled with excitement and anticipation. Along the way, they kept journals, took photographs, and documented their progress, unaware that these notes and images would later become crucial in piecing together their final days. To them, this was another adventure, one that promised hardship but also camaraderie, pride, and accomplishment. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, they encountered the usual challenges of heavy snow and freezing winds. Spirits, however, remained high. The group sang songs, laughed together, and supported one another through the harsh journey. Even when illness struck one of their companions, forcing him to return home early, the remaining 9 pressed on with determination. They were bound by a sense of shared purpose and trust in Igor Dyatlov's leadership. By early February, the group had reached the slopes of Kolet, a mountain whose name in the local Monsey language chillingly translates to Mountain of the Dead. To the hikers, it was simply another obstacle to overcome, another landmark on their path. They set up camp on the exposed mountainside, choosing to stay there rather than descend into the more sheltered forest below. This decision remains one of many puzzling choices that investigators would later question. From this point on, no one outside the group would ever hear from them again. Days passed, then weeks. When the hikers failed to return on schedule, families grew anxious. Authorities eventually launched a search party, sending teams of rescuers into the frozen wilderness. What they would discover in the weeks that followed was unlike anything they had expected. But before we dive into the haunting discoveries that stunned investigators and baffled the world, it is important to pause and remember who these hikers were. They were students, engineers, and athletes, young people with bright futures ahead of them. Their journey was meant to be a test of courage and skill, but instead it became one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. And so, with the stage set in the frozen heart of the Ural Mountains, Let us begin unraveling the story of what happened to Igor Dyatlov and his companions. A journey that began with optimism and determination would soon spiral into confusion, tragedy, and endless speculation, a story that still echoes through history as the enduring mystery of the Dyatlov Pass. As the days passed beyond their expected return date, worry began to grow among the families of the hikers. At first, there was hope that perhaps the group had simply been delayed by bad weather. After all, the Ural Mountains in winter were notorious for blizzards, heavy snowfall, and sudden storms that could slow even the most experienced adventurers. It was not unusual for expeditions to arrive later than planned. But as time stretched on, that hope began to fade. When several days had gone by with no word, the alarm was finally raised. Friends, classmates, and family members began demanding answers. The hikers were supposed to have sent back a telegram confirming their safe arrival at their destination. That message never came. Concern turned into fear, and authorities were forced to organize a search effort. What began as a routine mission soon grew into one of the largest rescue operations of its time. Volunteers, students, military personnel, and professional mountaineers all joined forces to comb the rugged wilderness. The urgency was heightened by the brutal conditions. Temperatures dropped to deadly levels, and strong winds made visibility poor. Rescuers knew that every hour mattered, because survival in such cold without proper shelter and clothing was nearly impossible. The first breakthrough came when search teams discovered the hikers' abandoned tent high on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. The sight was both puzzling and deeply unsettling. The tent appeared to have been slashed open from the inside, as if the hikers had cut their way out in a desperate hurry. Their boots, coats, and most of their belongings were still neatly laid out inside. Nothing seemed stolen or disturbed by outsiders. It was as though the group had suddenly decided to flee into the night, leaving behind essential gear that they could not have survived without. This discovery only raised more questions. Why would 9 experienced hikers, fully aware of the dangers of exposure, abandon their shelter in the middle of the night? What had frightened or forced them so severely that they tore their way out rather than calmly unzipping the entrance? The search continued, and soon rescuers began to find the first bodies. 2 of the hikers were located at the edge of a nearby forest, lying under a large cedar tree. Strangely, they were dressed only in light clothing, without the heavy coats or boots needed for sub-zero temperatures. It appeared they had tried to build a small fire, using branches torn from the tree above them. Their bare hands and missing gloves suggested desperation in the freezing cold. Not far from the tent, 3 more bodies were discovered, scattered across the snow as though they had been attempting to crawl or stagger back to their campsite. These hikers were better dressed, but still lacked critical protection against the brutal weather. Their positions hinted at a desperate attempt to return to safety after fleeing. By this point, it was clear the Dyatlov expedition had met with tragedy. But the story was far from over. 4 hikers were still missing. And what investigators would uncover in the following weeks would only deepen the mystery. When the final bodies were eventually located in a ravine some distance from the cedar tree, the rescue mission transformed into something far stranger than anyone expected. Unlike the others, these victims bore injuries that defied easy explanation. Some had fractured ribs, one had a shattered skull, and another was found without her tongue. Even more unsettling, their clothing seemed to contain traces of radiation. A discovery that fueled speculation about military involvement. For the families waiting back home, the news was devastating. Their children had set out on what should have been a triumphant adventure, only to vanish into the snow and be returned lifeless under bizarre circumstances. For the authorities, the case presented a challenge. Not only did they have to explain the deaths, but they also had to do so in a way that made sense to a grieving public. Yet, the more evidence they collected, the more baffling the situation became. Ordinary accidents could not explain all of the details. The tent torn open from the inside, the missing clothing, the scattered bodies, the severe injuries, each element seemed to contradict the idea of a simple avalanche or hypothermia. Instead of closing the case, each new discovery opened the door to more questions. The mystery of what happened on that frozen mountainside had only just begun to take shape. The rescue teams had found the hikers, but they had not found the answers. And as investigators began piecing together the evidence, theories emerged, each one stranger than the last. The discovery of the tent was perhaps the most chilling and perplexing clue in the entire Dyatlov Pass mystery. To any trained mountaineer or rescue worker, a tent is a lifeline in the wilderness. It is warmth, safety, and protection against the brutal cold. For 9 experienced hikers to abandon their shelter under such conditions defied all logic. And yet, there it was, the tent, battered by snow and wind, still standing, but empty. At first glance, rescuers assumed the group had simply left in a rush, maybe to escape some danger outside. But as they examined the tent more closely, the details told a very different story. The canvas had been cut open from the inside, with long slashes that suggested the hikers themselves had carved their way out. Why would they do this? When the entrance flap was perfectly functional, what could possibly have driven them to rip apart their only refuge in the dead of night? Inside the tent, everything seemed eerily intact. Sleeping bags were laid out as though the group had been preparing to rest. Personal belongings, clothes, food, cameras, and diaries were all still in place. Even boots, jackets, and essential gear were untouched. The impression was almost as if the hikers had been startled into action so suddenly that they did not have time to collect even the most vital items. To investigators, this created an unsettling picture. If the hikers had fled willingly, surely they would have taken at least some of their clothing or equipment. The temperatures outside would have been fatal within minutes without proper protection. Yet the tent suggested a scene of sudden panic, as if the group had been driven to escape an immediate and overwhelming threat. Adding to the strangeness was the fact that the cuts in the fabric were made from the inside outward. This detail is crucial. It meant the group was not trapped by something outside trying to get in, but rather they themselves felt a desperate need to get out. Such a decision is baffling to seasoned outdoorsmen, who know that leaving a tent in freezing winds without preparation is nearly suicidal. Some rescuers and researchers later speculated that the hikers might have heard strange sounds, felt the snow shift above them, or even believed an avalanche was imminent. In that case, cutting their way out could have been a split-second reaction to what they thought was danger bearing down on them. But when investigators studied the area, they found no evidence of a large avalanche. The snow slope was shallow, and no signs of mass movement were recorded. The camp remained largely undisturbed, which contradicted the idea that a natural disaster had forced them out. Others suggested psychological factors. Could the group have experienced some kind of mass hysteria, perhaps caused by stress, exhaustion, or even exposure to infrasound, a low-frequency vibration known to induce feelings of panic in humans? If so, their sudden decision to slash open the tent might have been the result of irrational fear rather than an actual threat. Yet such explanations still struggled to account for why all 9 hikers acted in unison. Another element that puzzled investigators was the placement of footprints in the snow leading away from the tent. The tracks suggested that the hikers had walked, not run, into the night. There were no signs of a frantic stampede, no evidence of a chaotic rush. Instead, the footprints were calm and deliberate, as though the group had organized themselves before leaving. But why then destroy the tent fabric in such haste? Only to walk away in a collected manner. The tent thus became more than just a shelter. It became the central riddle of the Dyatlov Pass case. It told a story of panic and calmness all at once, of sudden fear followed by organized retreat. This contradiction haunted investigators, because it suggested that the hikers were reacting to something beyond ordinary comprehension. To this day, the abandoned tent remains the most haunting image of the Dyatlov Pass incident. It stands as the physical heart of the mystery, a silent witness to whatever terrified the group that night. Its torn canvas whispers of desperation, of an unseen force that drove 9 young people into the darkness without their boots, without their coats, and ultimately, without their lives. And as the investigation deepened, the tent would only lead to more questions. For what rescuers found next, scattered across the snow and hidden within the forest, would shift the story from a tragic accident into one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The more investigators studied the tent, the more unsettling the picture became. While the cuts in the canvas already hinted at panic, what remained inside raised even greater questions. Nearly all of the hikers' possessions were still there, untouched, as though frozen in time. Their backpacks, loaded with food supplies, lay neatly arranged. Extra clothing, warm jackets, and heavy boots, items absolutely essential for survival in sub-zero conditions, were left behind. Even their mountaineering equipment, cooking utensils, and notebooks were undisturbed. It was as if the hikers had vanished suddenly, stepping away from their lives in the most inhospitable place imaginable. This detail is critical because it paints a stark contradiction. These were not inexperienced wanderers. Each member of the Dyatlov group had undergone training and previous expeditions. They knew that leaving without protective clothing meant death within hours. So why would they abandon everything they needed to stay alive? What compelled them to make such an unthinkable decision? The state of the tent revealed a sense of order rather than chaos. Nothing appeared stolen or scattered, and there was no evidence of a struggle inside. Journals and cameras were carefully placed, and food rations were untouched. This was not the scene of a robbery, nor did it resemble an attack by wild animals. Whatever had driven the hikers outside, it had not disturbed their belongings. To many investigators, this was one of the most baffling aspects of the case. If danger had truly come from outside, whether human or animal, the logical response would have been to grab essentials and run. Instead, the hikers left with nothing more than the clothes they had been wearing at the time, some barefoot, others in thin layers inadequate for the brutal cold. The untouched belongings also highlighted another oddity: there was no attempt to return. The tent was easily visible from the slope, and despite some of the hikers being found not far from it, none of them seemed to have re-entered the shelter to retrieve gear. Even as some members apparently tried to make their way back toward the campsite, the items remained where they had been left. This absence of survival instinct was deeply unsettling. One explanation proposed was that the group fled in a sudden burst of fear, intending only to escape for a short time and then return once the danger had passed. In such a scenario, they may have believed they would only be outside for moments, not realizing the peril that awaited them in the freezing night. Yet the footprints leading away from the tent stretched nearly a mile, suggesting that they kept moving steadily away rather than circling back. Others speculated that the hikers were disoriented, perhaps suffering from snow blindness, hypothermia-induced confusion, or even the effects of infrasound vibrations from the wind passing over the mountain. These conditions could create irrational fear, causing them to flee into the darkness while leaving behind their most important possessions. But this still did not explain the systematic, almost calm way in which their equipment remained arranged inside. For the families of the hikers, the knowledge that their children had left everything behind only deepened the tragedy. Diaries recovered from the tent captured moments of joy, determination, and unity in the days before their disappearance. Photographs taken by the group showed smiles, laughter, and camaraderie. The contrast between those images of youth and hope, and the silent, abandoned tent with all their belongings untouched, was almost unbearable. As investigators studied the scene, they began to realize that the tent itself was less a source of answers than a catalyst for new mysteries. Every detail seemed to contradict the idea of a simple accident. Why leave boots and jackets behind? Why not return for them? Why were food and supplies left as though the hikers never intended to come back? The untouched equipment became one of the central enigmas of the Dyatlov Pass case. It told a story not of ordinary survival, but of something extraordinary, something that forced 9 capable hikers to act against all logic and training. This unanswered question only deepened as rescuers followed the trail of footprints and began discovering the bodies of the hikers themselves. Their conditions, their clothing or lack of it, and their locations would add yet another layer to the chilling puzzle of what happened on that mountainside in 1959. The abandoned tent was only the beginning. The most haunting discoveries came in the days and weeks that followed, when searchers began to uncover the bodies of the missing hikers. What made these discoveries especially strange was not just the condition of the bodies, but also their locations. Instead of being found together, the group was scattered across different parts of the mountainside, as though they had fled in multiple directions yet remained bound by the same fate. The first 2 bodies were located about 1.5 kilometers away from the tent, near the edge of a dense forest. They were lying under a large cedar tree, with only a few remnants of a small campfire nearby. Both were dressed in little more than undergarments, barefoot in the snow, their hands bearing signs of torn bark, as though they had desperately tried to climb the tree for warmth or protection. The absence of proper clothing in such unforgiving temperatures suggested a shocking truth. They had left the tent in extreme haste, never returning for survival gear that could have saved their lives. A short distance from these 2, searchers found 3 more bodies, including that of Igor Dyatlov himself. The trio appeared to be positioned between the cedar tree and the tent, as if they had been attempting to return to camp. Their bodies lay spaced apart, frozen mid-journey, their positions hinting at a desperate struggle against the cold. These findings painted a grim picture. Part of the group had run toward the forest, seeking shelter and warmth, while others had tried to make their way back to the only real protection they had left behind. But the story did not end there. The remaining 4 hikers were missing much longer, buried deeper in the snow and hidden from view. When they were finally discovered months later, the scene became even more disturbing. Their bodies were located in a ravine not far from the cedar tree, partially covered by snow. Unlike the others, these hikers were better dressed, as though they had tried to share clothing from those who had already perished. Yet their injuries were far from ordinary. Some suffered from broken ribs and internal bleeding, others from severe skull fractures. One young woman was missing her tongue, a detail that would ignite decades of speculation and horror. Strangely, there were no external wounds consistent with such trauma. It was as if the injuries had been inflicted by a powerful force, one too great to be explained by a fall or simple accident. The fact that the hikers were scattered in separate groups baffled investigators. If they had faced a natural disaster like an avalanche, why did not they stay together? If they were attacked, why was there no evidence of a struggle? And if they had simply been caught in the deadly grip of hypothermia, why were their bodies found at varying distances, as though they had made conscious, yet divided, choices about where to go? The layout of the bodies suggested a sequence of events. The first two succumbed quickly, unable to survive without clothing or fire. The three in between fell next, frozen as they tried to return to the tent. The last four, hidden in the ravine, endured the longest but met a violent and mysterious end. This uneven distribution of survival created one of the case's greatest puzzles: why some hikers had suffered horrific injuries while others showed no more than the expected signs of exposure. For the rescuers who uncovered these scenes, the mystery was almost too much to bear. Each discovery brought both answers and new questions, leaving behind a trail of contradictions that only deepened the enigma. The Dyatlov Pass tragedy was no longer just a story of hikers lost in the snow. It was a story of fear, separation, and unexplained forces that seemed to defy natural explanation. To this day, the image of those 9 lives cut short scattered across the icy slopes of the Ural Mountains remains etched in history. Each location told a different part of the story, yet none could reveal the full truth of what happened that night. And with the recovery of the bodies, investigators were forced to confront the most haunting question of all. What could have driven 9 capable young hikers to such a bizarre and tragic end? One of the most striking and haunting details of the Dyatlov Pass tragedy was the state in which several of the hikers were found. Despite the brutal cold of the Ural Mountains in winter, many of the victims were only partially clothed. Some wore nothing more than undergarments, while others were barefoot, their feet exposed to snow and ice that could kill within minutes. For investigators, this discovery was as baffling as it was tragic. In survival training, the very first rule is to protect the body from the elements. Hypothermia can set in quickly when temperatures plunge below freezing, and frostbite can destroy skin and tissue in just a short time. The hikers, all of whom were young and experienced, would have known this. They had prepared meticulously for their journey, packing warm clothing, boots, gloves, and heavy jackets. Yet when their bodies were discovered, much of that protective gear remained untouched in the tent, while the hikers themselves faced the night wearing little more than the clothes they had slept in. This oddity gave rise to one of the earliest and most chilling theories, the phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. In extreme cases of hypothermia, the body's nervous system can misfire, creating the false sensation of overheating. Victims, believing they are burning up, begin to strip off clothing even as their bodies are actually freezing. Searchers wondered if this could explain why some of the Dyatlov hikers were found nearly unclothed in the snow. But paradoxical undressing alone could not explain everything. Some of the victims did have layers of clothing, though often mismatched and clearly not their own. It appeared as if, in their final moments, survivors had taken garments from companions who had already perished, attempting to shield themselves from the unrelenting cold. This grim detail painted a picture of desperation, cooperation, and perhaps the very last act of survival among the group. Still, the question remained, why had so many left the tent without proper gear in the first place? If the hikers had fled in panic, why did not they at least grab coats, boots, or gloves on their way out? The tent contained everything they needed, yet they ran into the night with almost nothing. Some investigators argued that this pointed to a sudden and immediate threat, something that did not allow them even seconds to prepare. Others believed they may have intended to return but never got the chance. The barefoot tracks in the snow only deepened the mystery. Rescuers noted that footprints leading away from the tent were both bare and socked, interspersed with some made by boots. This strange mix suggested that while a few hikers had time to put on footwear, others had none at all. The image is haunting, a group of young people, half-dressed against the freezing night, walking into the wilderness in a line, their reasons unknown. For many, this detail ruled out the idea of a simple accident. Experienced hikers simply would not make such a catastrophic mistake unless something extraordinary had occurred. Was it fear of an avalanche, the shock of an unknown sound, or perhaps the influence of something psychological or environmental that distorted their perception of danger? Whatever the cause, the inadequacy of their clothing contributed heavily to their fate. Exposure to the elements was unforgiving. Those who left without boots stood no chance of surviving for long. The forest fire under the cedar tree hinted at a desperate attempt to fight the cold, but the limited clothing on the first two bodies showed that they could not last through the night. This detail hikers scattered across the mountain, many half-dressed, some barefoot, became one of the most enduring and disturbing aspects of the Dyatlov Pass mystery. It was not just their injuries or their locations that baffled the world, but the very fact that they had left behind the most basic tools of survival. To this day, the image of these young adventurers, stripped of protection against the snow, remains one of the most chilling pieces of evidence. And as investigators probed further, they would uncover details even more confounding, injuries so severe and unusual that they seemed impossible to reconcile with ordinary explanations. Broken bones, shattered skulls, and wounds without external cause, mysteries that would elevate this case from a tragic accident to one of the most debated unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. As investigators continued their grim search, they uncovered details that transformed the Dyatlov Pass tragedy from a story of exposure into something far stranger. While several hikers had clearly succumbed to the cold, others bore injuries that were difficult, even impossible, to explain. These wounds were not the kind typically associated with hypothermia or frostbite. Instead, they pointed to a force far greater than what the human body could endure. Among the final 4 hikers found in the ravine, rescuers documented severe and unusual trauma. One victim's chest was crushed, with multiple fractured ribs and massive internal bleeding. Another had a shattered skull, the kind of injury that could only result from an immense blow. Yet, curiously, their bodies showed almost no external marks, no bruising, no cuts, no evidence of blunt force impacts from rocks or falls. It was as if the injuries had been inflicted by an invisible pressure, a force capable of devastating internal organs without breaking the skin. This discovery baffled forensic experts of the time. Normally, such injuries would be consistent with a high-speed car accident or a powerful explosion, not with hikers caught in the wilderness. The lack of corresponding surface damage only deepened the enigma, leaving more questions than answers. Adding to the mystery, these injuries were not uniform across the group. Some of the hikers were found with relatively minor wounds consistent with exposure, scratches, frostbite, or abrasions from crawling through snow. Others, however, had suffered trauma so extreme that investigators struggled to imagine a scenario that could cause such differences among people who had fled together. One possibility raised early in the investigation was that the victims had fallen into the ravine where they were found, sustaining fatal injuries from the impact. But experts noted that the depth of the ravine was not sufficient to explain the level of force required to crush ribs and shatter a skull in such a way. The surrounding terrain showed no signs of rockslides or heavy debris that might have caused additional damage. Some speculated that the snow itself might have been involved, that the victims had been caught beneath a block of compacted snow or ice. But again, no evidence of such a collapse was ever found at the site. The snow around them appeared natural, with no signs of a major avalanche or structural failure. These contradictions left investigators searching for alternatives. Could powerful winds have thrown the hikers against rocks or trees? Could hidden environmental factors like sudden shifts of snowpack or underground tremors have created conditions strong enough to inflict such injuries? None of these theories fully satisfied the evidence. The disturbing nature of the wounds also gave rise to more speculative explanations. Some wondered if the group had encountered military testing in the area, perhaps high-explosive devices, shockwaves, or experimental weapons that left behind no trace. Such theories gained momentum because of the secrecy surrounding Soviet military activities during that era. Others turned to more unconventional ideas. That the hikers had faced some unknown natural force, something beyond ordinary human experience. The case files noted these injuries with a tone of scientific precision, but also with a clear undercurrent of bewilderment. The investigators could document what they saw, but they could not explain it. And for the families who read the official reports, the idea that their loved ones had been crushed by an unknown force without explanation was both terrifying and unsatisfying. To this day, the injuries stand at the heart of the Dyatlov Pass mystery. They resist simple answers, straddling the line between accident and anomaly. What is clear is that the hikers faced something sudden, violent, and overwhelming, something that not only drove them from their tent into the freezing night but also inflicted wounds that left no easy trail of cause and effect. The question remains, what kind of force could break bones as if under the weight of immense pressure, yet leave the skin almost untouched? It is a question that continues to fuel debate, drawing scientists, historians, and mystery enthusiasts into endless speculation. And as unsettling as these injuries were, they were not the only shocking discovery. For among the bodies, one detail stood out above all others, a detail that continues to haunt the Dyatlov Pass case and spark the imagination of all who hear the story: the absence of a tongue in one of the victims. Among the many strange details of the Dyatlov Pass tragedy, one in particular has remained the most chilling and unforgettable. When investigators examined the bodies of the final 4 hikers discovered in the ravine, they were stunned to find that one of the victims, a young woman, was missing her tongue. This detail, recorded in the official reports, immediately set the case apart from other survival tragedies, and ensured that it would forever remain a subject of speculation and debate. The woman in question, Lyudmila Dubinina, had been a strong and determined member of the group. She was also one of the better prepared hikers, often described by her peers as resilient and disciplined. Yet when her body was recovered, investigators noted not only severe chest injuries but also the shocking absence of her tongue. To many, this discovery seemed almost too bizarre to believe, a detail more at home in a horror story than in a forensic file. Forensic examiners offered explanations, but none were fully satisfying. One possibility was natural decomposition. Animals or the environment might have caused damage to soft tissue after death, particularly in the moist and snow-covered conditions of the ravine. The idea of scavenging wildlife, such as small rodents or insects, was raised. Yet some experts pointed out that other soft tissues like lips and facial features remained relatively intact, making it difficult to explain why only the tongue would be so completely gone. Another theory was that flowing water in the ravine could have contributed. The body had been found partially submerged, and some suggested that the movement of snowmelt or ice might have gradually eroded and removed soft tissue. But again, the precision of the loss seemed difficult to reconcile with natural causes alone. For many, the missing tongue quickly became a symbol of something darker. Some speculated about violence, imagining scenarios in which the group might have been attacked or silenced in some horrific way. Others tied the detail to conspiracy theories involving secret military tests, arguing that the unusual injuries and radiation traces found on some clothing might hint at a cover-up. In such narratives, the missing tongue became a metaphor for suppressed truth, a clue that something had been deliberately hidden. Yet official reports made no suggestion of foul play. Instead, they carefully recorded the fact while noting that environmental factors likely played a role. Still, for families reading those documents, the effect was devastating. To learn not only that their loved ones had died mysteriously, but also under such unsettling circumstances, was a wound that could not easily heal. The image of a missing tongue has since taken on a life of its own in popular retellings of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Writers, filmmakers, and researchers have all seized on this detail, often emphasizing it as the most grotesque and inexplicable part of the story. It is easy to see why, in a case already filled with confusion-torn tents, scattered bodies, strange injuries, the absence of something so personal and symbolic adds a layer of eerie finality. But perhaps what makes this detail so powerful is not simply its shock value, but what it represents about the case as a whole. It is a reminder that despite all the evidence collected, from photographs to footprints, there are still elements of the Dyatlov mystery that refuse to yield to logic. The missing tongue stands as a haunting metaphor for the silence of the hikers, who cannot tell us what happened, and the silence of the mountain, which has kept its secret for more than 60 years. Forensic science has advanced since 1959, and modern investigators have attempted to revisit the evidence. Some remain convinced that natural processes are the most likely explanation. Others insist that too many anomalies remain for the case to be closed so neatly. Whatever the truth may be, the detail of the missing tongue continues to echo, sparking curiosity and fear in equal measure. And while this discovery captured public attention, it was only one part of the broader mystery. Beyond the condition of the bodies, investigators also noted something unusual about the site itself. No signs of struggle, no indication of outside interference, and yet no clear explanation for why 9 experienced hikers had met such a fate. This absence of evidence would soon become as perplexing as the injuries themselves. As shocking as the injuries were, one detail stood out in stark contrast: there were no signs of struggle with other humans at the Dyatlov campsite. Forensic experts, search teams, and investigators combed through the area, looking for footprints, evidence of conflict, or any indication that the hikers had been attacked. Yet nothing of the sort was ever found. The footprints leading away from the tent were calm and deliberate, showing no signs of a chaotic escape from attackers. There were no trails of pursuit, no extra sets of prints in the snow beyond those of the 9 hikers themselves. The tent, though slashed open from the inside, showed no marks of forced entry from outside. Even the scattered belongings inside were undisturbed, as though no outsider had touched them. This absence of evidence posed a serious problem for anyone hoping to explain the tragedy as the result of human violence. In many wilderness survival cases, conflicts can break out among groups under stress. Arguments over direction, resources, or fear can escalate into physical confrontation. But in Dyatlov's case, nothing suggested that the hikers had turned on each other. The distribution of the bodies showed no signs of combat or self-defense. And the injuries, though severe, were inconsistent with knife wounds, blunt objects, or weapons. The lack of struggle also made it highly unlikely that an unknown party had entered the camp. If attackers had approached, why were there no footprints? The snow around the tent was untouched except for the tracks made by the hikers themselves. Could the wind have erased evidence? Perhaps. But investigators noted that the prints of the hikers were still visible, preserved in the icy surface. If their tracks survived, why not those of outsiders? This mystery deepened suspicions that the cause of death was not the result of human hands. If not attackers, then what had forced the hikers from their tent and into the deadly night? Theories diverged here. Some argued for natural phenomena, an avalanche, sudden winds, or environmental hazards that caused panic. Others leaned toward less conventional explanations, suggesting secret military tests or even encounters with the unknown. Still, the forensic record was clear: there were no defensive wounds, no cuts or bruises from knives or fists, and no torn clothing that suggested hand-to-hand combat. Even the most injured hikers bore trauma inconsistent with ordinary violence. Their ribs and skulls had been crushed by forces greater than any human could apply. Investigators, despite intense pressure to provide answers, had to admit that they could not link the deaths to any known assailant. For the families, this brought little comfort. On one hand, they were told that their loved ones had not been attacked by criminals or strangers. On the other, they were left with an even more unsettling reality: the hikers had faced something inexplicable, something that left no clear trace behind. The mountain itself, silent and unforgiving, seemed to guard its secret. In the decades that followed, the absence of human struggle became one of the most compelling aspects of the case. It kept alive the argument that the Dyatlov incident was not murder, not sabotage, but rather something stranger. Researchers pored over the files, photos, and autopsy reports, noting again and again that everything pointed to an invisible adversary, whether nature, technology, or something more mysterious. The Dyatlov Pass tragedy, then, was not just about what was found, but also about what was not. No footprints of strangers. No signs of violence among the hikers. No evidence of intrusion. Only silence, broken tents, and scattered bodies left behind in the snow. And yet, the mystery did not stop there. As theories multiplied, attention turned to possible explanations beyond human involvement. Could the military have been testing weapons in the area? Could natural forces like avalanches or infrasound explain the panic, or was the truth hidden in something even more unearthly? The lack of human struggle ruled out many possibilities, but it also opened the door to even stranger interpretations. With the evidence gathered from the mountainside, investigators struggled to explain what had really happened on that fateful night in 1959. The bodies, the torn tent, the missing clothing, the bizarre injuries, none of it fit neatly into a single, satisfying explanation. And so, theories began to emerge, each attempting to solve the riddle of Dyatlov Pass, yet each leaving behind more questions than answers. The most conventional theory pointed to an avalanche. Perhaps the hikers had heard the snow shifting above them and, believing they were about to be buried alive, cut their way out of the tent in panic. In such a scenario, their decision to flee without boots or jackets could be explained by fear of immediate suffocation. But when investigators examined the slope, they found no evidence of a large avalanche. The incline was shallow, the snowpack undisturbed. Even modern studies of the site suggest that while a small snow slide may have occurred, it still fails to explain the scale of the injuries or why the hikers spread out so far from camp. Another widely accepted explanation was hypothermia. The brutal temperatures and high winds of the Ural Mountains could overwhelm even experienced hikers. Hypothermia, after all, can create confusion, disorientation, and even the phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. But again, this theory struggled to account for the crushing chest injuries and fractured skulls that some victims suffered. Exposure to the cold could explain death, but not the violent trauma hidden beneath the skin. As Soviet officials searched for answers, another possibility loomed: secret military activity. The Ural region, remote and little traveled, was known for weapons testing. Some suggested that parachute mines or experimental bombs could have exploded near the hikers, their shockwaves causing internal injuries without external marks. Radiation traces found on a few pieces of clothing fueled suspicions of military involvement. Could the hikers have stumbled into a restricted zone, becoming unintended casualties of classified experiments? The secrecy of the Soviet era meant that such questions were rarely addressed directly, leaving space for speculation to flourish. But as years passed, theories became even more varied. Some proposed that the hikers had encountered an unknown creature, a yeti or other mysterious being that had terrified them into fleeing. This idea found traction in part because of the torn tent and scattered bodies, though no physical evidence of animals or tracks supported it. Others turned their attention skyward, suggesting that UFOs or unexplained lights in the night sky had played a role. Local reports of strange glowing orbs in the area around the time only encouraged such speculation. More scientifically grounded researchers looked to natural but unusual phenomena. Infrasound, caused by the wind passing over the mountain's contours, was one candidate. Low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing can induce feelings of dread, panic, or disorientation. Perhaps the hikers had been driven to irrational fear by such a force, tearing their way out of the tent and scattering into the night. Yet even this theory could not fully reconcile the violent injuries sustained by some of the group. The range of ideas reflected the deep unease surrounding the case. Every theory explained one piece of the puzzle, but none explained it all. The avalanche theory accounted for fear, but not for missing tongues. Hypothermia explained the lack of clothing, but not the broken bones. Military tests explained the injuries, but not the absence of footprints or blast marks. UFOs explained the mystery, but lacked tangible evidence. Each hypothesis both illuminated and obscured, keeping the truth forever out of reach. Faced with mounting questions and pressure to provide closure, Soviet investigators finally delivered an official conclusion. Their report stated that the hikers had died from the effects of what they described as a compelling natural force, beyond the hikers' ability to overcome. It was a phrase as vague as it was unsettling, one that closed the case without truly solving it. For the families of the victims, it brought no comfort. For historians and researchers, it left the door wide open for endless debate. Decades later, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Books, documentaries, and scientific studies continue to revisit the case, each proposing new angles and fresh interpretations. Yet none have managed to dispel the aura of uncertainty that hangs over that frozen slope. The mountain still guards its secret, and the 9 hikers remain silent witnesses to whatever occurred on that February night. Perhaps the truth lies in a combination of factors: a small avalanche triggering panic, hypothermia clouding judgment, and desperate survival decisions leading to tragedy. Or perhaps, as some continue to believe, the real answer involves forces beyond our current understanding. In the end, the Dyatlov Pass mystery is not only about what happened, but about how little we may ever know. And that may be the most haunting aspect of all. 9 young lives, full of promise and adventure, ended abruptly on a desolate mountainside. Their story reminds us of the fragility of human endurance against nature, but also of the enduring power of mystery to captivate our imagination. More than 60 years later, the Dyatlov Pass has become not just a location, but a legend, a riddle carved into the snow, unsolved and unforgettable. So, as we leave the icy slopes of the Ural Mountains, we are left with one lingering thought: some mysteries resist explanation, not because answers do not exist, but because the silence of history is stronger than the questions we ask. The Dyatlov Pass will always remain such a mystery, one that invites us to wonder, to imagine, and to remember the 9 hikers whose final journey became a story that time itself cannot close. And that brings us to the end of today's journey into the Dyatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has sparked decades of debate and still has no definitive answer. Whether you lean toward the avalanche theory, hypothermia, secret military experiments, or something more unexplainable, the truth is that the 1959 tragedy remains one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. If you found today's story fascinating, do not forget to hit the like button to support the channel, and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Every like and subscription is a huge motivation for us to continue exploring more chilling mysteries, from unsolved cases to historical enigmas that still puzzle the world. We would also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened to the Dyatlov hikers? Which theory makes the most sense to you? Share your opinions in the comments below. Your perspective might shed new light on this legendary case. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Remember to turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to know when a new video drops. We have many more journeys ahead, stories of mysteries, secrets, and unanswered questions waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and never forget, sometimes the greatest mysteries hide right in the middle of reality itself.